Terrific. Glad to be here. I'm in Big Sur, California, taking a break, and this is a kind of interesting kind of timing for this, and it couldn't be more perfect following Michael, because I seem to be just about a generation older than he is, and much of his conversation will connect to my discussion of the influences, many on a very personal level, of things that affected me as an architect. And I'll start just briefly on some of the things that Michael started with his family, and that I think as you get maybe older and you're looking back, and I'm in a place right now where I'm thinking about real derivation within more academic terms, but in very real personal terms. And there's no question that very, very much of my ambition as an architect, connection to the more complex, subjective kind of aspects of the work is absolutely connected. That starts when you're a child. And again, I'll just briefly say that I have, I guess, a somewhat typical, but somewhat complicated kind of childhood. I again, parallel to Michael, I came out of a Midwestern, very conservative, if you know anything about politics, it was a Goldwater kind of family. And I grew up in Gary, Indiana. My father was an executive, a CEO for U.S. Steel, and a very an industrial town just outside of Chicago. And I was there until I was 8 years old, and I'm definitely a city boy that comes out of that. And I have a background, again, very Midwestern. My father comes from a farm in Tipton, Indiana, and he was the first of the family to go to college. He was maybe the only. No, he was the first in the family to go to college, and he went to the University of Illinois, and then left the farm, and became just a business person on a kind of a global level. But it led to kind of experiences of myself growing up in a very urban, kind of very tough place. And in the summers I spent on the farm, which are still absolutely livid in my memory. And we're definitely connected to a certain notion of self-sufficiency, because it was still a time when a 200-acre farm was completely self-sufficient, and you built the barn and you did the tractor and you had a farm and on and on. And my memories there are just vivid and incredibly powerful. My parents divorced when I was 8 or 9 years old, and out of that we moved to California with my mother. And
Thom,
definitely those types of first.
Can you put the camera a little bit down so you will see your full face, if possible?
Can I what?
You go a bit up. We need you. We don't see your full face right now. Perfect. Okay. That's a bit better. If you go up, it's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
And the personal things are going to connect later to things I'm going to talk about, starting with conflict. And in my case, as we moved to California, an out-of-placeness as a young person. And we were now very difficult economic situation. And I lived in a working class, very kind of tough neighborhood called Los Nietos, which was south of Whittier, California. And I spent 9 years old through, I don't know, middle high school, essentially getting beat up and being quite lonely and very much on my own. And I was already, I didn't know it, I didn't understand. I'm kind of an artistic kid, not a sports guy. And being a young man in California in the late 50s and 60s as a not sports kid is not good. And I was just out of place. And I was extremely on my own, and was struggling academically, socially. I remember when my high school counselor, I had also had incredibly complicated relationship with my mother, and it was affecting my own performances at different levels. And in high school, I was having a real hard time. And a lot of it was just emotional, and I was getting F's and A's, and I was a real problem child there. I spent most of my time in the principal's office. And I remember in my senior year, I'm in a counselor's office, and I'm having a hard time getting in school because of my grades. And yet I came from a very academic, cultured family. My mother is a pianist and went to the Versailles School of Music and has had great expectations. That there was not even a question I'm going to college. And I remember my counselors saying, "Now, you should be going to a trade school or to a kind of a lower level college." And for some reason, I had some sort of ego strength then. It's really weird because I remember telling her to fuck you, and which didn't go over well either. And anyway, I ended up going to applying to San Luis Obispo, and showed up there. And the first people I met, the first three students were three young women, and they were on horseback. And it was hilarious. I took one look at that and go, "There's no way this is going to work for me. This horses aren't my thing." And I walked over I went home, went over the next day to USC, and school already started, and asked to meet the dean. And again, I think back at this, am I still on? My computer just changed.
Yes, you're on. You're on.
Okay, my computer, yeah, just changed. And I remember meeting the dean, and I just went to meet him. And I think back, I can't imagine how I did this. I'm 18 or 19 years old, and I'm like I want to go to SC. And I didn't even apply. And he was a new dean. His name was Hurst. And he actually let me in. And I started at USC, and it started my architectural direction. And I was very much focused to architecture. I'd won a competition in high school to design a house, and it was really crazy if you look back. And it got me interested, but it was very much connected to an era where young boys made stuff. And I remember years later meeting Stephen Hall. We had a very similar kind of a young man's kind of background of building hot rods and motorcycles and building and making things. And I came at it from absolutely not what's taken place over the last decades, from something much more intellectual, much more conceptual, et cetera, but came out of it through something much simpler, having to do with making things, building, construction, and the kind of the joy that comes with that. And something that it's the intelligence of things and the interest in that. Context. I think in terms of my work, that the thing that'd be most kind of interesting or would be the most kind of profound in terms of my generation of producing architecture or our effect on our work would have been the context of the 60s and 70s. And again, some of it is very obvious, but still it has to be stated. And in my case, some of it was very personal. But it starts, of course, with the general political context. And it's interesting, listening to the inauguration this morning, we're now returning to some, quote, normalcy in terms of the status of this country. What was it, Amanda Gordon? If anybody heard it, her poem at the end was absolutely magnificent, and it kind of returns us to something that's much more affirmative and positive about the nature, the potential of this country, and we're back to some sort of normalcy. Well, my context, of course, were the Kennedys, and were Martin Luther King, and the Malcolm X's, and the Eldridge Cleavers, etc. And they had huge influence, and much like Michael, was converting me during my college years from my republicanism or not a really thought out political position, but one that just came with my family and it would be a long conversation, but a kind of very Midwestern kind of acceptance of continuity, let's say, and of something that's a bit backward looking for comfort versus forward looking, even in the 60s with the space effort and the moonlight, all that kind of stuff. It still is part of that. And then, of course, with me, I'm just in front of Michael, was Vietnam and civil rights. And of course, Vietnam was my generation. My brother died in Vietnam. And it was the absolute kind of focus of your existence between 19 and, in my case, and 24 years old, et cetera. And it was a huge influence later on kind of the thinking of architecture's role. But the influences in terms of architecture were maybe less than film and music. Again, at SC, there was a change going on, and Ralph Knowles was changing the program into something that was much more connected to a broader set of organizational ideas that were connected to what later is going to become an ecological movement. And even then, he was connected loosely to McHarg and Christopher Alexander, and they were looking at something much more systemic and much more complex as a system of thinking what architecture was. And it was a really interesting time in the program. And that at the end, I had Gregory Ain and Craig Elwood and Seriano and a group of very kind of distinguished LA architects, and we were just not interested in that. And also there was this look forward. There was at the time, I guess, a somewhat naive and kind of odd looking back of not looking at history. I left 5 years of undergraduate education of USC and had only the slightest knowledge of who Mies, Alto, Corbusier, Kahn, we could go on, were, right? That came later, right? And it was much more kind of a quasi-scientific kind of thinking. And so when I'm getting out of school, the first people that are influencing me are, and it's somehow intuitive. I can't quite even locate at that time what was in my head, but it was the Archigram boys and Super Studio and Hans Ruger. And there was some new energy. Of course, Archigram had arrived at UCLA my last year at USC, and I was going over there kind of watching the tent cities and all the stuff going on. And I met Ron Herron and Pete Cook and the whole gang, and was just completely taken away. But what came out of that also was a collective, which I'll talk about later, which had to do with the formation of my studio. And then, of course, the art scene was rampant in LA, and I'm living in Venice, and Ace Gallery is starting to have some of its first shows, and Doug Christmas, of course, was the head of all this, and Michael Heiser and Terrell and Irwin are all having their first shows, and it was absolutely incredible. And again, a couple of years later, when we're starting SCI-Arc, I'm bringing my class over to see Terrell's work and to see Heiser's work and discuss the kind of thinking that's taking place with the art community. It's across the street from where I live, and it was very, very much kind of connected to what's going to happen later in my work. And then, of course, film and music were huge. And I'm saying all this because architecture is in the distance somehow. It's somehow the least kind of influential in terms of my thinking of what architecture was or wasn't. And of course, film, I'm in the kind of the center of a renaissance. And whether it's Truffaut or Antonioni or Godard or Fellini, all of them share kind of an over-the-topness. All of them share a very kind of conceptual kind of thinking of the relationship of film as a medium. And then, of course, music is huge. And it's inescapable. It's a part of my world that I'm living in. And again, it has this power emotionally that's quite different than the architectural thinking, which is a bit safer and a bit more conservative and definitely not as risk-taking, etc. And whether it was Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk, I remember taking trips up to San Francisco, and I forget the club now, but listening to Thelonious Monk and just being completely awed by that. And I'm 30 miles from here. I'm at Big Sur right now in Monterey. And I'm listening to Jimi Hendrix play Hey Joe. I'm listening to him as he throws his guitar out at the end of the scene, etc. And I'm in Los Angeles at various clubs, and I'm listening to Frank Zappa, and all of them are sharing a set of kind of an emotional characteristics in their art form that are extreme. And all of them share some sort of an over-the-topness, let's say, a commitment to an art form, which is just having huge, huge influence on what I think I want to be, kind of where I want to be, where I want to go. And then I guess what would be important to this, and I'm thinking of especially the younger people that are listening today, would be kind of what is the meaning of the above? What's the kind of how does this affect us in terms of our work as architects? And in my teaching, in my academic work, I have more and more conversations with my students in terms of the difference of the environment that they were nurtured under. and it makes me, I guess, it does make me somewhat. It develops a generational divide, and it's based on the nature of what took place in this little fragment of time, a decade and a half, between the 60s and the middle 70s, and but it definitely left imprinted in me certain notions of comfort having to do with change, which was the medium that and it all had taken place about some level of transformation and the transformational power of an art form. And it was comfortable with conflict. It was comfortable with the complexity of Faulkner-esque, a Finnegan's Wake kind of complexity of life, and an interest in an acceptance of not understanding or having to put together all the pieces. That there is a series of unresolvable conflicts that live together, that have to do with the heterogeneity of both the society in political terms, and the relationship of reality, again seen through just something like Faulkner, and with that, the kind of this extreme kind of involvement in the art form, and all of it having to do with some connection, which would be now connected to an architectural idea of the modern movement, of kind of the power of architecture in terms of shaping behavior. That we have a possibility of shaping the nature of how the world operates in both social and personal terms. And all of it is interested in a certain level of criticality and an operational strategy which is based on resistance. And again, the notion of resistance would come directly out of this, and clearly out of my younger years, in terms of the relationship of the Martin Luther Kings and the Muhammad Ali's, who's now one of my heroes. And this is going to lead into, I think, in the beginning of my practice, in terms of a notion of autonomy. And I'm going to be, I think, as I started Morphosis, it's now 1972, and I'm starting my office. There's going to be a relationship between some struggling with the relationship of the connection of architecture as a political art form, and the relationship of autonomy, which is so much connected to the people I'm naming in terms of the film and music, etc., in terms of their art form. And then so I'm starting my career, and I'm at Gruen I didn't really work for anybody for a couple of years. I'm at Gruen for a year and a half, and I'm working with Victor Gruen, and I'm getting involved in city planning, and I was much more prepared to that coming out of my education at USC than I was architecture. And then I'm being recruited to teach by somebody I met just before I got in, Jim Stafford. And we're about to start Morphosis as we're teaching in Pomona. And then all of us are getting fired. And we're starting with a group of 6 people. They were led by Ray Cappy, who started the initiative to start a school. We started SCI-Arc. And again, that's, again, I'm looking, I can't see anybody out there, but if I could see you, it would be a discussion that I think you're going to find your life as an architect is in some ways kind of out of your control, and it's fascinating. Because I look back and I look at I try to connect the dots and find this circuitous line. It's the Calvino-esque, not a straight line, but a very, very circuitous line that goes from A to B to C to D, and it's somewhat coincidental and happenstance, and it is chance, and so all of a sudden we have this idea of starting a school, and it's this absolutely ridiculous idea, and we bring 40 of ourselves. And again, Michael mentioned several people, and this group of people it will include kind of all the people we talked about in one way, and there are people that had a huge influence on me, because I'm all of a sudden in an environment. I'm this 26-year-old kid, and the people I'm meeting now in LA as I start the academic part of my work are the Craig Hodges and the Robert Mangurians and the Coy Howards and of course Eric Moss, and these are amazing people. And if any of you want to look back, you're going to. Michael showed a picture of Robert. And what they share, as I look back, definitely to the East Coast guys, is they all shared that kind of extremeness that I'm talking about in terms of my interest in film and music. And they they saw themselves as artists, and they saw architecture as part of an art form, and they behaved like artists, which isn't tolerated in the East Coast, I have to say. I also went to Harvard, and I'll chat about that in a minute. And the both their talent and their interest in the work and their commitment to the work had this huge influence in me as I look back and look at my environment as I was growing up in Los Angeles. And then I it was at SCI-Arc. I was sort of the grad program, and we got dinged by the accreditation group, and I didn't have a grad degree, and they sent me back. They gave me a sabbatical, and I went to the my grad degree there, and I went there on a kind of pragmatic reason. I didn't. I'm now 30 or something, and wasn't actually that interested in other than retooling a little bit and meeting people. And I have to say, my educational environment, not counting Ralph Knowles at SC, isn't the main forming of my existence. And although I met very interesting people there, and it was an interesting time for me, and I later got to know some of the same people. Michael showed up, and as friends. But I also found that after this environment of Los Angeles, absolutely frozen. I was in a place there was no possibility I could work, not a chance. I'll never forget. I'm on my way back after a year in Cambridge in Boston, and the first thing I did is Mike Rotundi picked me up at the airport, and we were now partners, and we went straight to Frank Gehry's house, and it was just finishing construction. And it was this complete breath of fresh air. I'm back in LA, and this is kind of an environment I'm comfortable with, and you can think freely. Oh, does this mean we're just about over?
Please finish your point. Please explain that, and if you want, we can start with the conversation.
And then we're just about to, okay, and then after that, we were now kind of starting Morphosis, and it's coming directly from Archigram as a collective, and we understand architecture as a collective form. And then we're in the 80s. We're doing all of our conceptual work, and Mike and I had just this great run of thinking, and we had very few buildings, and maquettes at scale. We're producing conceptual ideas of what is going to become the studio Morphosis as more traditional architects that are building. And of course, during that time, I met my wife, and Blythe and I were together, and the kids and all the stuff that Michael talked about in terms of family. I left that out. And of course, she kind of ran the place for a while as we grew, etc. But again, where do I end that? The change now, since we're 20 minutes already? I can't. Damn, I'm about halfway through. I was
no problem.
What happens now is we're working on larger scale work, and there's going to be a reconnection to the connective tissue and the relationships of things versus the autonomy. Because for the first 20 years, I was absolutely fighting for the autonomy of architecture as an autonomous art form, right? And then as the work got larger, it forced me to rethink that and find a comfort between both autonomy and obligation, let's say. All right. And at this point, it's been now maybe a couple decades that it's a both and strategy. And I think it confuses a lot of people because we're supposed to be our earlier self, the bad boys. And clearly for 15, 20 years, I've been working on we're doing embassies and courthouses, et cetera, highly political projects. And in the end, I think it becomes a much more kind of realistic model of the nature of architecture. But you still fight for the autonomy. And that's something I'll never give up. But I now see it, I can separate my involvement in architecture to those acts that are much more private and personal, et cetera, and those which relate to obligation. It's going to have a lot to do. You're smiling now, telling me I got to stop, but it's going to have a lot to do with teaching, I think. because I think there's a confusion today with I see, or at least there's a question mark with young people in terms of the role of them as in their artistic, subjective, conceptual capacity, and versus the role as their obligation in terms of their architecture as a political act. I
You
guess
speak
that
so fast, it's so difficult for me to interrupt you. I have not the chance to do that. You have mentioned so many topics I would like to ask you about, but we don't have that much time. You mentioned that you are in Big Sur and you are taking a break, right?
taking a break.
But you have so much energy. Do you need a break?
Sure, everybody needs a break.
No.
I've spent 2 or 3 weeks in the Yucatan for 40 years. And you never stop. You think. As you know, architects never, you work 24/7. And as I'm getting older, it doesn't change. It's the same thing.
How has your work ethics changed during the last decades?
With ethics?
Your work ethics.
How has it changed? When?
During the last decades, if it has changed, maybe it doesn't have. There was no change for you. Have you changed the way you work?
Well, that's a real general question. Yes and no. No, in the sense that I'm constantly of work that comes out of a collective. So I'm engaged in the area 24. Yes, to some degree, very recently, in that I'm spending more time in my private work and I'm returning to the autonomy a bit more, and that I've been. My own assessment is I'm too involved in the obligatory, and I want some of the privacy back, and some of that comes my own literally private artwork. That base is the basis of the work, by the way, is the way the drawings are has to do with the generative development of the work. It is always, the drawings are never, they're all semi-autonomous, both autonomous as art forms, and they're connected as part of the thinking of organizational strategies or building making.
What motivates you the most about the upcoming years? You just turned 77, so congratulations for that. Happy birthday from our whole team. What motivates you the most about the future?
I think, and it's been mostly found in my teaching, is that I think the most compelling challenge around infrastructural urban projects in the nature of our urban development. And
we have some
of this area, operational tool problem, and it's been my focus for a decade now.
We are having some connection issues. I don't know if it's my computer or the whole connection. Maybe it's because you are in the mountains. That could be.
Oh dear, I can hear you perfectly.
That's great. That's a good part. That's a good point. You are there with your wife, Blaise. What kind of influence has your wife been on you?
Well, huge. I wouldn't be me without her. Blythe, I'd have her tell you, but she just walked out the door. The in every aspect of life, and she was in the fashion world and in the business world. And as I was starting to grow, and as we were having children, she started working with me, and basically reorganized and produced a studio that had the kind of organization, efficiency, and management that was required, and was hugely powerful in setting up my studio. And she's also this unusual person for me who both helps me in very hard decisions with the pragmatism of business and supports me. And it's both and that's just to support and making decisions that would be not traditional for most, with supporting my own interest in architecture, and that comes before everything. And that I'm really connected to some of the people I was naming in LA. We have I think, somewhat of an unusual studio, and that it has nothing to do with business. That complete secondary. And I'm just producing work, and everything else is secondary to make that happen. And we have to keep the so that is always part of the deal. Are you losing me again?
Yeah, I'm losing you. Give me one. Is it stopping? I don't know if it's my connection or your connection. So what I will do is connect. So it's probably being Thom connection. So I would like to ask Michael to join us so that we can have the round table discussion together.
You here? She's not here. She went for a walk.
Hi, Michael.